Then if I could get our all our panelists back up here again, and Rebecca Jacobsen is going to moderate discussion.
Thank you so much for engaging with us throughout the day, and certainly not running out the door yet and hanging in here at the end. Thank you also for indulging me with a few opening comments and reflections before I get to the questions that I'd like to pose, not to just the last speakers we've heard, but really questions that I think were informed by what I heard throughout the day. So first, my background is in politics and policy, so let me start by talking a little bit about politics, my view of politics, and how I think it's shaping teacher preparation policies today. So often in discussions about education, politics is the dirty word. It's corrupt, it's evil, it's something that we unfortunately have to put up with, and if we could, we would rid ourselves of it. When something goes wrong, we often invoke the phrase, well, that's when the politics came in and sort of ruined the best of ideas. So in short, politics is something bad. But I take a different view as a scholar of education politics. It's not something to be avoided at all costs, but rather a process through which we, as a collective, struggle to allocate our scarce and precious resources. Politics is the way that we as a society work out our conflicting values and goals, and that these conflicting goals or dilemmas, as Jack gave us that word this morning, are not going to go away. So I don't think we can avoid the politics. So politics is inextricably tied to our democracy, and as David Plank and Bill Boyd so wisely stated, democracy is not just an instrument for accomplishing policy objectives, it's the way of living together in a pluralistic and diverse world, a forum in which issues are discussed in an effort to achieve a deeper understanding. So I'd like to argue that rather trying to avoid some of the politics that often are invoked as something that is a problem, that we should instead embrace it and try to better understand it. So what are the current politics of education, and how is that shaping the teacher preparation policies that we see coming at us today? Well, for several decades now, we have been living and creating policies under what I think of as the politics of crisis in education. There's been a steady and increasingly loud drumbeat that the system is broken. The result is, as has already been said, there's been a steady erosion of public confidence in the U.S. education system. In the 1970s, when the Gallup pollsters asked the public about their confidence in public schools, nearly 60% expressed that they had quite a lot or a good deal of confidence in the public schools. In 2012, we hit an all-time low, and it's only bounced back slightly. In 2012, just 29% expressed that same level of confidence. And don't get me wrong, some skepticism in the system is good. We need to be kept in check. But I think we've crossed that line from a healthy skepticism to all-out widespread pessimism, and I think that can be really damaging to the possibilities for our future. So how has this public mood of pessimism and crisis shaped education policymaking? Well, first, I think the politics of crisis impacts the pace of policymaking. When there's a crisis, something must be done. Time is of the essence. The public wants something done, and it wants it done now. Second, the politics of crisis impacts how open the public mind is to experimentation. Because the current condition is deemed to be so dire, the public mentality becomes one where anything, any alternative that's been proposed must be better than the current horrific situation that we're in. This leads to greater public acceptance to try new, often untested ideas, often on some of our most vulnerable populations. And third, the politics of crisis shapes who is a potential source of evidence and expertise in policy development. Certainly when there's a crisis, you don't go to the people who created that crisis to get you out of that. And so the public now believes that a new set of actors are needed to get us out of this crisis. So I think thinking about this trio of results that come out of the politics of crisis sort of helps us understand why we have seen this flurry of policies coming at us rather than from us about teacher preparation. So this prompted some questions for me in the talks that I heard today. And the first was that little voice that you hear in the back of your head that kept saying to me, the debate is about what the debate is about. What I mean by that is that to control the terms of the debate is often to win the debate. And I believe that the teacher preparation programs, and by that I mean quite broadly, teacher preparation programs broadly, regardless of type, have lost the debate about what the debate is about. We're reacting to others, as Sarah, I think, showed us. So I'm wondering from the people that we've heard from, how would you define the problem of teacher preparation? And then what could we do to reclaim that definition in the broader public space?
Couple things. I talked about surfacing the values that underlie and talking about the differences in, what are the purposes of public schools, how do you measure success, that we never really talk about those. And so I think that's one way. And I think an examination, I talked about this 3.0, and it's not just about us, whether we're education entrepreneurs or university teacher educators. There are people out there who send their kids to public schools. There are lots of teachers in those schools who contribute a lot to teacher preparation. And so we need to broaden who is discussing those things, including the underlying assumptions and values, some of which we agree about and others we disagree about.
I'll say just a little. I'm part of this project also involves a lot of interviews, and I just got back from doing some of those, so I don't want to over-reflect on what's fresh on my mind. But I will say that one thing that strikes me from the people I spoke with, some of whom were very involved in some of the things I was describing, there is perhaps a little bit of an accountability hangover, and that there actually, I think, really possibly is a window. So I'm not necessarily maybe the best person to say what that debate should be about, but I would say that the opportunity seems maybe more present than I think over the entire time period that we've been studying in this project. Karen?
I was just going to suggest, this might not be working, but I could probably be louder enough.
No, speak into the
For
microphone,
All right.
it's for being recorded.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Speak into the microphone.
Does this work? No? Is there another? All right, maybe now. Oh, now it's working. Okay, so I was going to suggest that I was very struck by the fact that across all of these three presentations, there was this kind of theme of the lack of voice of our sort of field. In a way, the social network theory work really showed that there are a lot of people participating in this conversation about what good teaching looks like, what learning looks like, what teacher preparation should look like, and we're not a part of that conversation. And the same thing with kind of the conversation about the rhetoric, the point that Renee made about sort of the rhetoric needs to change. And I think there's a huge question for us as teacher educators about how do we build public understanding about the complexity of teaching and the importance of really paying attention to student learning and what that can look like, and sort of helping people understand that in a really deep way. And I feel like a lot of politicians and folks that we've been sort of arguing with for a long time have been extremely good at getting a particular idea about teaching across, that it's service, that it's an easy thing to do, that all you need to do is to be sort of good at your subject in order to be a good teacher. And I think we have not been particularly good as teacher educators at sort of helping the public understand the complexity of teaching, and in providing a vision of good teaching as a professional practice that can be learned over time. And it's so interesting that, I think in a way the biggest challenge for us is how do we start to be part of that conversation? We have Twitter, we've got Facebook, we've got all these ways of technology that perhaps we could harness to start to be part of that conversation and to start to sort of help build public understanding. So I see that as like a potential lever that we're not really taking much advantage of.
So just a couple things. One of them is that we've created a community, an organization in our community called Tucson Values Teachers. It's a 501c3. I'm a founding director of it. And it's affiliated with a CEO group called the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. So we are enlisting the support of the business community because the business community understands the value of education. It turns out that even though a lot of governors and state legislatures believe that they'll attract business by cutting taxes, that actually is not what attracts businesses. It's quality of life and quality of education in the community. That's where businesses go to relocate. So our business community understands that. So we're building an alliance with the business community. That has not been easy because there are many social policy issues for which I don't agree with those CEOs. But we came to a kind of a happy medium when it comes to education policy. So that's one thing to do. The other thing is that the American economy and the kind of culture of innovation of this country is just amazingly robust. And we came out of the worldwide recession better than any other country in the world. We're given no credit for that in the education system. So somehow, I think we need to figure out a way. When I go to on my campus, when I talk to other groups, I always say, when other deans and their groups are around, I always say that the other colleges in my university are successful because their students were prepared by my graduates. And so I try to own the responsibility of having success. And then third thing, excuse me for being long-winded, and that is that we have become so economically stratified in this country that the economic and life chances of a whole sector of our economy is just really dismal. And it's not dismal because of what we do. It's dismal because of other kind of social policies that abut against what we do. And somehow we need to have policymakers who understand the integrated nature of that health policy, economic policy, these other kinds of policies influence the ability that we have to be successful. I don't know how to do that because it just is mind-boggling to be that complicated about it.
So Arthur and then Jack.
I want to be very plain spoken, and I want to be very critical. It seems to me that the unenviable position we're in now, we're responsible for. What's happened is there are 4 or 5 things that we've done. Number one is we are reactive, not active. As a matter of fact, we're action averse. And we're far better at complaining than we are at offering timely and constructive solutions to the problems that ail us. Charlie Brown ought to be our emblem. Second, we are terrible at communication. And what I mean by that is, we did a quick study. Policymakers don't read what we publish. Practitioners don't read what we publish. They say it's irrelevant and incomprehensible. We don't even read what we write. I looked at 11 journals. The modal number of citations was 2. We don't speak English. We talk in academic jargon. We don't use social media. We talk to ourselves. The data we present to the world, when we present it, is really weak. The fact of the matter is, anecdotes don't work anymore. If we don't think we deserve what's happening because we are so good, we have to prove it. And I see nothing out there that proves it. Teach for America, in some respects, is kicking our butts. I don't like their research, but they're offering research that shows they have modest successes in some areas. We're offering anecdotes. What's also true for us is that we don't have any effective self-policing. Accrediting for a very long time was a joke. And what happens if you don't have effective self-policing? You invite others in to do that self-policing. What happens is you invite the kind of conversation we talked about before. How many schools have you closed? There are a lot of lousy ed schools. I studied them. Even if it's just 1 out of every 5, we're not doing anything to enhance standards in our profession. And we need to. I think the bottom line for us is that we are most successful when we have 1 foot in the library and 1 foot in the street. And by that I mean our foot is in the current world. We understand what's going on around us. We've lost track. We've lost our footing in the street, and we need to regain it. And we don't have a lot of time. I think we're sort of like the Washington Post. It's now owned by Bezos, and it and the Boston Globe are worth less than the Huffington Post. By the way, those combined. The big danger is we keep doing what we've been doing. I've been hearing this conversation for the last 20 years, and we're not gaining ground. I think we could do things. I think we could make a difference, but I think we need to stop talking, and I think we need to take concrete action.
I am going to be surprisingly on topic right now. So to build on this point, I would say I think we need to ask 2 questions. And this comes now not out of my historical research, but actually on a current policy project that Rebecca and I are working on. And so I think those questions are, first, what do insiders know about teacher preparation programs? So the people who are actually inside these programs and affected by them, what is the kind of knowledge they have about these programs that gives them confidence in the effectiveness of them? And then second, we need to ask, how can that be presented in a relatively portable way for outsiders? So let me give you a quick parallel from K-12 education. So Rebecca referenced Gallup polling. So every year we get the PDK Gallup poll. It says that when you ask people about the quality of the schools that are attended by their own children, 70% of Americans, roughly, give those schools an A or a B. And then you ask them, well, what about the nation's schools? They say, oh, the nation's schools are terrible. 70% of people, again, plus or minus, I think 3%, give the nation's schools a C or a D. Big mystery. What's going on there? Well, first of all, which schools are people likely to know more about? The schools their kids are actually in, or the nation's schools in general? Never mind the fact we don't have a national education system. This is not a big mystery. Insiders have real, deep, holistic knowledge about the schools that their children attend. They often don't have the language that will accompany that deep knowledge, and they certainly don't have statistics, right? But they're not surprised when they look at data, and there's research showing this, that when you give them data for schools that they're intimately familiar with, they're not surprised by it at all. They already know. What do they know about the nation's schools? They don't know a lot. They hear some really scary stories about a very small number of bad actor schools, and then there's a lot of data that totally misrepresents the real quality of schools that they have access to. And I think the same is true when we're talking about teacher preparation programs, that people inside these programs, most programs, understand the true quality of these programs in some kind of holistic sense. And then nationally, there are a few bad actors who we hear really terrible things about, and there's some data that really distorts the quality of the programs. And so I would imagine that a lot could be accomplished in thinking through ways to present to outsiders the things that insiders know. And I think that for too long, that was not an imperative. Which I think is something that Arthur was saying. But it absolutely is right now, because otherwise you create this context where highly interventionist and disruptive policy totally makes sense. Because, you know, if it's broken, to turn the aphorism on its head, if it's broken, fix it.
And then Emily?
Well, from someone who literally made my living on reporting on policy and regulations and what was going on in the field of education from 1979 until Teach Now practically, I've had a real emotional response to this day, which is I can't believe these conversations are still going on. I can't believe that we're still talking about teacher preparation the way we did many, many years ago. I can't believe that we're still talking about alternative routes to teacher certification. I wrote books about it, and I'm astounded that it's been brought up as much as it is today, because nobody in my world anymore even talks about it. The private sector really is strongly got its tentacles in public education, and that is not going to change as long as these discussions about things like alternative and traditional teacher education and university-based teacher education versus non-university-based teacher education, nobody that I know who is interested in becoming a teacher cares one iota. They don't know about those discussions. They're not interested in them. They want to be teachers. They are not 18-year-olds going to college for the first time, majoring in education. There are 300 million people in the United States. There are 68 million teachers in the world. 4.7 million of them are in the United States. There are people all over the world that are dying to be teachers, who are potentially highly qualified to be teachers by any measure you want to throw at them. You want to test them, you want to look at their practice, you name it. They'll meet the mark. They don't care about alternative versus traditional. They don't care about university-based, non-university-based. They care about becoming a passionate, committed teacher for tomorrow's students in tomorrow's learning world. And that conversation has to become public for anybody that's going to survive going forward in preparing teachers. I am not a person who normally gives these kinds of tirades, so there it is.
Erin?
Yeah, hearing Art's comments about communicating the value of teacher preparation, and I agree with Emily, regardless of what pathway seems less relevant given some of the conversations we've had, but we've almost not at all mentioned students, K-12 students today. We really haven't talked about that at all, and it seems like unless we can contribute to the value proposition framed as what's good for kids that are being taught by our candidates or our graduates, we have a real problem with justifying what we're doing. And I think that's why the widget effect was so successful, because it was not a new idea and it was really simple. It seems implausible that 99% of teachers are highly effective if we see outcomes for students, all the related social policies that matter, out there and affecting students. But whether you want to measure that by graduation rates or even kids showing up to school because they like being there or doing well on these standardized tests that do serve as a gateway for the rest of their lives, that just doesn't make sense when we don't see kids achieving the outcomes that we'd like to see, but every teacher is receiving the highest possible rating that they can receive. So I think that for us, when we saw these data for our own certification programs, the value-added data, the teacher observation data, the principal ratings, and the student surveys, we had to ask, are all of these graduates of our programs teachers where we would want our own children to be in their classrooms? And the answer wasn't always yes, and it really did cause us to step back and think about how we structured our teacher preparation programs, because we were really focused on what we saw happening in classroom for kids, not just for the teachers in the building.
Ken?
Just very quickly, I'll say again, the we needs to be beyond the non-university and university teacher education community. That there are people who send their kids to public schools. We have a hugely inequitable distribution of the teaching force in the United States, where inexperienced teachers are predominantly in high poverty schools. Those with the least preparation initially. We need to include the public in the discussion of what public schools should be like and what kind of teaching should go on in the public schools, and we need to include teachers in that. And right now I see both of those communities excluded in the conversation, that we have these discussions in the halls of Congress, we have them at these academic meetings, but we're seeing school districts across the United States, including the one where I attended as a child in Philadelphia, being taken away from the public. And so I think that's part of the problem in a democratic society. It's not for just us to get together and decide amongst ourselves. And to me, that's a huge problem right now, the leaving out of the local communities where these schools exist.
So just to add one more comment and challenge to the conversation, we've heard a lot of you say we need to get our message out there to the public, and yet I'm thinking about Emily's comment about her program and building it under the radar on purpose. And we have increasingly, this drumbeat of crisis has raised education policy on the public agenda, and I often propose to my graduate students the radical idea of how do we get it off of the agenda, so that maybe we can be more under the radar to have some time. And I think that's the tension that we're wrestling with here of I think we are obligated to, in a democratic society, communicate with the public, but at the same time, how can we have that space under the radar to try to have time to work things out, because we know nothing's gonna be immediate. So with that, thank you, Bob, and thank you so much for hanging out with us until the very end.
Oh, no, not quite the very end.
Okay.
I get to be at the very end. So we assembled a group here that, as I'm thinking about this, we don't have anybody at the table who hates teacher education, right? We've got to, no, seriously, I mean, there are people out there who would say you don't need anything, right? Just get an adult and throw them in the classroom. We've got a bunch of people, all of whom aspire to improve teacher education. Teacher preparation is a highly differentiated enterprise, highly differentiated. You know, among the variety of different organizations that do it, we have some of that variation represented here in the group. And however you divide it up, there's variation within the variation. I would say, you know, listening to this, is the system broken or not? I'd say the system's probably not broken, but there are certainly some problems, and we're all trying to figure out how to improve some things, to some extent with different audiences in mind and different goals in mind. I was surprised at how much agreement there was on some things in terms of the programs. So, you know, Emily and Art both have programs that sound in many ways like other programs in terms of some top level. Everybody's thinking that field connections to the field are good, although exactly how that works and how much of that it is an open issue. So Ken's calling for discussions among people. I think this is a start and a group of people who wouldn't necessarily all talk to one another or even assemble in the same place. It doesn't include, you know, some other people, the parents and citizens, and also the people who think that the whole enterprise should be deep-sixed. But this is a start that I hope will continue among this group and with those of you out there. We're working to get a publisher for the longer versions of the papers that are going to be, that people have prepared here or have in the works. So stay tuned for that. We also have a plan to break up the video that was recorded here into chunks so that we can make that available to whoever would like to see it. And I want to thank you all, and thank you all across the nation for participating, and farewell.